Vive la résistance.
Hello and welcome to a semi-dev diary video in which we talk about all of the things announced at PDXCON for Hearts of Iron 4. The convenience of this is that Dan Lind, the main game developer, will be talking about most of it by himself, and I'll just come in occasionally to summarise things. And we'll try to keep this short, so let's just go straight into it.
Hi everybody.
Hi Dan. So for the first part, before we get into the workings of the teaser, there's always a pre-teaser chat. And this goes over some statistics about the game, but I only wanted to go over one small part of it regarding most nations played.
Top nation still Germany, but people do play a lot of minors now, more than majors actually. At the beginning, when the game launched, it was mostly people playing majors, but now it's really moved on to minors instead.
So one reason I think that it's moved from majors to minors, in my opinion, is the more things there are to do with minors. With majors, there seems to be a lot of focus towards a directed narrative, which we saw a lot with the Mexico focus tree. While with minors, you sort of explore your own progression, and I think something that really helped it was the formidable nations that came with it, which is something you see a lot on my channel.
Let's start talking La Resistance, because I know that's what you guys really want to hear about.
Yes, it is.
Doing France, French resistance, Spanish Civil War, Espionage, the big one, revamped Intel. There's a bunch of small features. I'm not going to have time to talk about everything. It's too much for even half an hour.
That's why we've condensed it into this smaller video.
This is the Spanish focus tree, and it actually shows off a feature that we have now, which is you can zoom. Actually, we might have done this one in Photoshop, but anyway, we added zooming in focus trees now because the thing is just humongous.
Oh my god.
We've been thinking about other ways as well to improve navigation of trees because it's becoming more and more important. But this, for me, is like step number one, the most important one, really.
Okay, so I think this is even cooler than it might sound because he's talking about future progression of how to navigate trees. And I'm hoping this leads on to a suggestion I once had where at the top of the focus tree there's tabs for the start of different focuses. So if you perhaps want to go straight to the political effort tree, you can just click on it and you'll go straight to the top focus political effort. Or if you're playing as Soviet Union and you need to go straight to the right hand side of your tree. So then he goes on to talk about the trees.
But they both have a lot of cool special mechanics. I think one sample here is the Congress of Paris.
And in the focus tree we saw this, which is an event for a focus. Now this focus is part of a wider focus tree for the fascist part of France, as seen here. Moving down through diplomatic freedom we get to the Latin Entente, which is mainly a union between Spain, Italy, France and Portugal. So these four powers combined, and that leads to the Congress of Paris. But this allows us to move on to our next topic, resistance.
Resistance. Completely revamping resistance. Essentially we want to give you kind of like the feeling of coring territory from EU4 in case you played that. We reworked all the laws. We split resistance into two parts. So there's now a thing called resistance and compliance. That means that you can have a very aggressively, resistant area, but it's still compliant because you got someone running it with like an iron fist, right? But it might be expensive to you. Biggest one that you're going to notice is that this removes garrisons from the map, like completely decluttering it, which is great. It's going to come with performance boosts for sure, although I haven't measured yet, but a lot less units tends to do that.
So this was something that was discussed in an earlier dev diary about how garrisons will be used. It seems to be quite good. I think it'll have a lot of interactions with the agencies and intelligence, which is the next topic to be discussed.
So let's move on to espionage. And this will be the first time you guys see this. So espionage really starts with the agency. And the agency is like an off-map building that you build. So you're going to actually, it's not political power or anything like that. You're actually expending industry to build up the agency and its different branches. And this is like the hub that you have for all the new shadowy content. So you're going to be, you can prepare operations from here, you can recruit operatives. So we have a thing called Spymaster, and essentially that means that there's only really one per faction that can leverage the full power of espionage.
Okay, so there was a lot to take in there, but the key point is that there's going to be a whole new espionage system involving spies that you hire to complete missions and operations. There will be, you can have lots of agencies, but between the factions, the Allies, the Comintern, and the Axis, there should really only be one spy master who dedicates most of his time towards the agency. I guess you could compare it a bit to like an air controller that can occur in multiplayer games, which will be the basis of all of your espionage. Let's carry on.
But by the way, you can customize the agencies. You can pick different logos for it. You can name it whatever you want. So if you want to be historical Germany and have like a bazillion different agencies who can't decide which one's the ruling one, you can definitely do that.
It was at this point I knew I was very excited for this feature, because the ability to customize and create your own history and do what you want with it, for me, is possibly the biggest appeal of the game right now. It is creating your own history. How would you do it? So yes, 10 out of 10, Paradox, take my money.
So here's different branch upgrades, and this is a way where you can decide how much you want to really lean into espionage as a feature. So, because this is something that you trade off with industry, right?
So let's take a closer look at it for ourselves, because these upgrades look very cool indeed, although we don't know yet how they'll work in practice, but just from the look. So it's about 5 civilian factories consistently for each of the upgrades to your personal agency. From what he describes, the defense is the most important one, in that they should be quite cheap and the ones you should go for if you're having a small one. And then below that we have the main operations, which is stealing, which is basically decryption, and invisible ink. I'm going to say that's our encryption. And at the far end there, suicide pills, which says that if one of your agents is captured doing their mission or operation, then they can kill themselves.
And we have examples here is like, yeah, you can have suicide pills for your operatives. So if the enemy captures them, they won't get much intel out of them because, they can chew their pills.
So, moving on to the operatives themselves.
Here we go, operatives. These are sort of your stars of the new systems. These are the guys that you send to build up networks in other countries. And networks really where everything starts. An agent can cover a certain amount of area. So if you have something like in this example picture, we have more than one agent to cover an area optimally. In the network, you can run missions. And missions are a lot like when you can see at the bottom here, it's a lot like when you have orders for your armies, right? You give them an area on the map to do something specific. Examples here can be you can do propaganda. You can do things like steer trade, so you can get your agent to schmooze up to the enemy or the neutral ambassador, so to say like, we need 20% more tungsten from you, Portugal.
So the missions appear to be the smaller versions of operations, which do just minor things to sort of help your nation along, maybe things you can do in peacetime and build up your nation through the agency.
Operations is like the next big thing. And generally, you might have more than one operative together doing these things. And it can be good to have operatives that have been sort of trained up with better traits if you want to do tricky ones. So here's an example of an operation. These things come with quite a bit of an investment. Actually, the example here is pretty cheap because it's a gatekeeper operation. What this one does is that you send in some agents to get a local contact in the resistance in a country, which essentially places like a token. So that's like your guy on the inside. And that's a gatekeeper to doing a lot more involved operations later. Once you have that kind of stuff, like say you get a guy on the inside of the military or the Navy, then you can start doing all sorts of stuff like stealing technology through those. Things like coups, for example, rely on having a lot of this stuff in there. And coups are becoming an operation instead of a diplomatic mission. So there's a lot more interest and play to them. In fact, you can target where you want them to happen and all that stuff.
Okay, so there's a lot to take in from this, but basically operations are the larger version of missions and seem to be much more influential. And also, they've completely got rid of the old diplomatic coup. So now there's a sense of progression. It's kind of a natural narrative. And again, one of the best features that has been announced for this DLC thus far.
At the bottom here, we're also showing kind of a cool new operation, which is to set up collaboration regimes. And if you want to have a historical example, this is like getting Quisling in Norway to kind of prepare the way for you as you invade. And that can be really good for Germany. You won't have time to do this everywhere, but doing it in a couple of places is going to make them capitulate easier and start them off with a much higher compliance value. So you won't have to deal with as much resistance. You can get more out of the area.
I think it's very interesting that there was discussion that by setting up a collaborative government before going to war, you actually reduce the capitulation requirements.
If you guys noticed, one of the department upgrades is for cryptography. And I don't know how many who know who Alan Turing is.
Who? Alan who?
What happens here is that if you've developed your own cryptology department in your agency, you'll be able to send them to crack the code in certain countries. If you crack the nation's code, and by the way, you can also build up your own crypto to be stronger. There's also interactions with operations where you can say send someone to steal the Enigma, which will be a huge help for you trying to crack their code. But anyway, once you cracked someone's code, you're going to get a bit of a passive benefit to it. But the problem is you cannot fully use this knowledge, because if you go and just straight up hit all the German transports, for example, they're going to know that you can read their radio transmissions, right? So you have a trade-off choice here, which is you can decide to fully use the information. That gives you full intel, a lot of bonuses, like especially to naval invasions.
Okay, and with that, I'm sure there will be negatives as well, such as debuffs from false information. So in overview, I think this is the second half to the agencies. We've had the missions and the operations. This half is talking about the passive bonuses of cryptology. It's your encryption, it's your decryption, which come with buffs and debuffs if you fall behind. Next comes Intel.
Intel. We're revamping the Intel system, and we're going to be splitting up Intel into several parts. So you'll have like civilian, military, air, and naval as well. To give you an example, right? You might have very good naval intel on someone. That means that you can see where they place their patrols. It means that you can see where their trade routes are, which means you can completely optimize your submarine forces, for example. There's a lot of different sources to gain the intel, and it all comes together in a new interface we call the Intel Ledger, which sort of replaces the detail view that we had before. And here you can like super dig into a lot of details about the country, switches out map modes, so you can go through and like check different areas, so you can figure out where the main factories are, for example, where their air bases are. It just basically lets you make more informed choices about how to tackle enemies.
And so Intel appears to be the second half of that cryptology, which is basic information we can find out about foreign nations. Intel is formed with scout planes, which I'm sure will be a new research on top of other things. All round, great side. He goes on to talk about how this works in passive ways, such as when you're just fighting a war against your enemy. You will naturally learn more about them the closer you fight with them and the more things you learn. It was at this point he started to move on to the end and talked about the future of Hoi.
Politics, and especially like internal politics, the difference in ideologies. Because I know you guys love things like monarchies. The neutrality ideologies become really crowded and it's kind of unspecific. It's an area where like pretty much the whole dev teams want to do cooler stuff for it, really.
Okay, so this is great news because Hearts of Iron 4 does have so many monarchies in it at this point, so many different monarchies at the same time, that the non-aligned branch just doesn't really quantify it well enough. There was a recent meme on the Hearts of Iron 4 subreddit which illustrated this slight frustration at the system, so it's good to know that there's a potential for change there.
There's also a lot of people asking about Soviet Union, which makes sense. It's a really big country. It's super important for World War II. And we absolutely could not fit it into this DLC because it was already smack full of Spain. And I think it's logical to be looking in the Soviet direction next time.
And I think it's logical to be looking in Soviet direction next time. And I think it's logical to be looking in Soviet direction next time.
But I mean, no guarantees. There's also like Italy that a lot of people want to see.
So there you go. Soviet Union, possible to be the next one. No guarantees there, but it's good to know that it is on the list.
And that's it.
Joy of joys, I hope you've enjoyed this quick overview of Hoi 4 at PDXCON 2019. If you've enjoyed, feel free to subscribe. hit the like, all those things. I'm very appreciative, and I'll see you next time.